first, top stories around the world. To discuss them, I'm joined now by former Labor MP Michael Danby, Sky News contributor Kosha Garda. Welcome to you both. I'm going to start with you, Michael, if I can. This Labor conference, there's concern from the Australia-Israel Jewish Affairs Council, Colin Rubinstein, that there'll be basically an extortion go on amongst the various factions in order to save the AUKUS security deal, which some from the left want to blow up. They'll sell out on Israel. They'll recognise Palestine. And of course, you know better than anyone as a former Labor MP, I mean, these motions are binding and they become part of the Labor platform. How do you see it?
Well, Doug Cameron and his dominant socialist left are a bunch of hypocrites, Peter. You won't hear them saying a word about the attack on Ukraine and the blowing up of the Orthodox Cathedral. They won't say a word about 2 million Muslims dragged off to camps in Xinjiang or the 300,000 in concentration camps in North Korea. But resolutions in favour of a state half run by a fanatic organisation called Hamas that throws gay people off roofs, and another bloke who is 18 years into a 4-year term, Mr Abbas. That's what they're focused on. I mean, the Australian people won't believe these kind of priorities. And yes, I'll confirm to you, that's their plan to do what they did in Victoria, to do it nationally. I'll put it in a vulgar term. They want to throw the Jews under the bus in order to save AUKUS. So they won't embarrass Albo on AUKUS. They'll get sort of some little reward, this pathetic resolution, immediate recognition of a Palestinian state. I'm calling Doug Cameron out and his socialist left hypocrites. Why don't you raise other resolutions of more importance on foreign affairs or of interest to the Australian people?
I tell you what, it's a pretty damning indictment, and Michael's absolutely right to say that these things should be in the national interest, Kosha, particularly because Labor's in power. They have a resonance around the world. So if it looks like there's a horse trade on AUKUS, we'd be talking about it if it was happening in the House of Commons, if it was happening over with the Democrats in power in the White House. You've got AUKUS, you've got the Palestinian state issue, there'll be other ones on the table, and it's a factional power play. I'd call it out if it was the Liberal Party too. We deserve better than that, don't we, on foreign security issues?
We do. I think the operative phrase in what you said there is it's a factional power play. And just this, it's a reflection in some ways of the environment that we're in, an increasingly fragmented electorate all around the Western sphere and elsewhere. And then you have these coalitions that are patchworks of, coalitions of the fringes, essentially, and they have often little in common, or they have other sort of pet causes that don't line up. And then you see when there's something like this that's a moment of truth or a big deal that should be in the interest of national security, you just see those factions kind of bleed out and people taking advantage of that with the horse trading. And I think this just shows that as a case in point.
Let's stay with Israel, Michael. Overnight, we had that legislation passed through, trumpeting it as judicial reform. I think most news services I looked at last night were calling it highly controversial. Help me understand it, because when I sort of dug into it, what it appears to me to be is the right of the government to appoint judges. Now, that's what happens in Australia. That's what happens in the US. That's what happened in the UK. The courts don't choose the judges in our countries. That's what's now going to happen in Israel. Why is that so controversial?
People get very emotional over this issue. Both sides, hundreds of thousands of them. Bob Carr will be very confused over this, demonstrating with Israeli flags. So it's not as if they're not patriotic or good people on both sides. Look, the power of the Israeli Supreme Court has largely been invented by itself. You're right, it's a paradigm of judicial activism. The doctrine of reasonableness was never legislated by Parliament. It was invented in the 1990s by a very activist Supreme Court Chief Aaron Barak. So it'll now go to the Supreme Court, this actual legislation, to see whether the debate was fairly treated. So they will actually judge this law that's just been passed. And there's a package of other legislation making your exact point that in Western democracies, the Parliament has primacy over any court. I mean, you can't take Mark Dreyfus or Albo's ability to appoint judges to the High Court here. And
let me just underscore that. That's because we elect the politicians and we'll judge them on the quality of the judges they appoint, but we don't elect judges. And so if judges were choosing judges, we could have a justice system that is disconnected from the electoral power of the people. That's the argument.
Precisely, and they're only proposing 50-50. So they're not even proposing that the government choose all of them, as they do in Australia, or the President does in the United States, or the UK does. Yeah. So it's, you know, we have to be fair. It's a difficult issue, and there are all kinds of compromises that can still be reached.